Kyle did the best.
Good job, Kyle.
So I'm Caroline Flesher, the relatively new director of the Center for Global Studies, and I'm here with a whole bunch of new equipment, in case you couldn't guess. So you all get to be the guinea pigs and also to test out this venue for us in Centennial. I want to really welcome you to the 2021 Centennial Speakers Series. We're really delighted to be here because this is sort of UW's home away from home in the snowies, right, Centennial. And we're really grateful to Jesse and the staff here at Fair Bottom for opening this space to us so that we can reassemble as a community after this strange year. And of course, we're also grateful, and I will remind you, for the lemonade, the cookies, and the coffee that are just through this door. And I want to begin with sincere thanks to the community of Centennial for their commitment to the Center for Global Studies and to the work of University of Wyoming students in their international contexts. Now, this has been a really difficult year, and international research is difficult to accomplish anytime. But if we can figure out how to meet under the sky in Centennial in May, I think we can figure out how to go global wherever we are. And Centennial gets to continue to shift the world through the work of these students. So as we reinitiate Centennial speakers in person, we want to really sincerely thank two people who started this project and have remained core to it, and luckily enough, they're both here. And that is Jean Garrison, and we have so many of Jean's students and fellow workers here. And Jean, we know, is a professor of vision and the utmost generosity to students and to the college and the community. And that is a remarkable combination and of incredible value to us. And we want to thank Nancy Zenny, who's been our partner at Centennial Library. So thank you both very, very much for all your past efforts and your present contributions. And now I get to introduce the introducer. Our MC today is Sean Bunning, and he's the assistant director at the Center for Global Studies, along with Kelly, who's running everything else. And Sean facilitates the work of our awardees around the world, and he pays very careful attention to their progress. So watch out, Sean's going to be with you and watching all the time. So that means there's no better person to introduce them to you. So, Sean.
Okay, thank you very much, Caroline. And I don't know that I agree with the last comment. There probably are several people who could do a better job introducing today because I'm a little sleep deprived, working on a grant proposal the last couple nights. But because of that, not all my neurons are firing as they normally would, and so I have brought a cheat screen to help me remember the titles of the projects that I wouldn't otherwise be able to introduce. But we have three students that we're featuring today to cover research that has atmospheric disturbance apparently behind me. I don't know what that's caused by, but we have three students that we have supported through the Centennial Fellowships, actually that were awarded in the spring of 2020, and were first deferred at the start of the pandemic affecting travel through UW and through our normal policies, and then of course slowly but surely seeming to affect every corner of our sphere that we live on, if there are corners to it. So we have had a long time paused and wondering how to move forward best and most efficiently. Fortunately, the students that we're featuring today are pioneers in finding out how to do that. When people like me couldn't quite think through it, students found a way. And so two of our students who will be speaking will talk about research that they have been able to complete, albeit with some adaptations to make it possible to go forward. And then our final student will also be talking about research that has been facilitated and made ready with the funds and should move forward very soon as travel is fully able to go to the part of the world that he's heading to. So the three students, we're going to go alphabetically because I couldn't think of a better way to do that. So Matthew Giles, who has just graduated recently and moved to Denver for a new internship and also a new master's program. He's working with the International Rescue Committee, on a project working with survivors of torture, right? I'm sorry, from refugees from different parts of the world in different circumstances. So that's an exciting new project that he'll probably talk about maybe at the tail end of his presentation if you're interested, or in the Q&A. Matthew Giles was able to do a research project in New Zealand that was titled From Carjobs to High Rises, an arts-based exploration of how underage sex workers experience change with adulthood in New Zealand's, in New Zealand's decriminalized sex industry. And I think very quickly before Matt comes up, I will first introduce the other two speakers as well, and then I'll let them follow suit right after him. So following Matt's presentation, Natalie Gordon, who also has just recently graduated from the University of Wyoming and will be heading off to Minnesota soon. She was able to move forward with a project that focused on Bolivia, and her project is entitled Social Reproduction and Coca, Identity, Politics, and the Economy of Coca Growers in the Chapare, Bolivia. I don't know if I pronounced that right.
Perfect.
Spanish isn't one of my languages, but that's okay. And then finally, Kyle Sabourin will be heading to Jordan just as soon as we can get him on a plane and everything works out on the other end for landing. And his project is entitled Political Engagement as a Factor of Return Among Syrian Refugees. So, without further ado, I'll ask Matt Giles to come forward and let us know how things worked out in New Zealand. There you go.
Switch the setting.
Arrow buttons.
What is it?
The arrow buttons on the keyboard.
It looks like that.
You want good or do you want force to get in there?
All right. Hello. My name is Matt Giles, and like Sean said, my project is From Carjobs to High Rises, an arts-based exploration of underage sex worker experiences and how they change with adulthood in New Zealand's decriminalized sex industry. All right, so in New Zealand, in 2003, New Zealand became the first and only nation to fully decriminalize the sex industry with the passing of the Prostitution Reform Act. Under this act, all previous laws pertaining to sex work were rendered null, and adult citizens were now legally permitted to engage in transactional sex, as a worker or as a consumer. However, under the PRA, underage sex workers are prohibited, so clients are not able to engage with underage sex workers. While previous studies have highlighted the increased safety and protections of adult sex workers, underage sex worker experiences have been disregarded in policy development and academic research. And because minors do identify as sex workers, it's critical to include their experiences in research and discussions pertaining to sex worker safety. To reveal the undisclosed impacts that the Prostitution Reform Act has had on underage sex workers, it's critical to understand minors' experiences before and after turning 18 within the context of New Zealand's decriminalized sex industry. And to do this, my research was guided by the following questions. One, how does the Prostitution Reform Act impact the experiences of underage sex workers? Two, did the experiences of underage sex workers change with adulthood? under the Prostitution Reform Act? If so, what factors contributed to these changes? And number 3, how do workers who began in the industry as minors visually communicate the memories of their experiences as underage sex workers, and how do they depict their current experiences? All right. The project would not have been possible without the help of NZPC. NZPC is an organization based in New Zealand, and it was created by sex workers for sex workers' rights in 1987. They played a pivotal role in the passing of the Prostitution Reform Act, and therefore I sought out their assistance with my research design and participant recruitment. Okay, so the resilience of art-based methodology. Initially, I planned on going to New Zealand, Wellington, Christchurch, and Auckland, and working with sex workers there. I wanted to conduct focus groups and do arts-based research there, followed by individual interviews. And because of the accessibility of arts-based research, I also wanted to construct a visual art gallery with all of the art pieces that the sex workers and the participants created. So I planned on going to New Zealand, but COVID halted all international travel. So therefore after suspending my trip for months, my research became virtual. And virtual within the context of my research refers to how participants were recruited, data was collected, and the study was conducted. It wasn't virtual data. So while conducting remote research made most factors exponentially more difficult, some aspects of my previous plan were not feasible virtually. For example, focus groups. Focus groups, which are challenging to coordinate, facilitate, and transcribe without extraneous complications, became inconceivable due to the virtual platform. It also prevented me from visiting NZPC locations or brothels or agencies to recruit participants, and it confined me to escort websites and personal advertisements and virtual snowball sampling. Also, the 19-hour time difference made scheduling interviews difficult, and then the internet glitches, spotty reception, and sometimes unclear audio created gaps in the final interview transcriptions. And because of these challenges, my goal of recruiting 25 participants slowly dwindled to 3 by the time my research was done. While I anticipated the various hurdles that would accompany virtual arts-based research, the setbacks were minimal. Some of the details and intricacies of the artwork, which are unique to the mediums and the artists themselves, were lost in the virtual photographs of the art pieces. Also, the dimensions, which often carry meaning, were reduced to a digital snapshot on a computer screen. And additionally, while NZPC agreed to administer art supplies, the participants only utilized the materials that they had immediate access to, which may have limited the creative potential of their art pieces. However, in hindsight, the separation between me and the participants may have granted them another layer of autonomy in the research process, allowing them to make creative and artistic decisions without my influence or injection in the process. Although some details may have been lost in arts-based methods, the process still encouraged creativity and symbolic thinking, allowing participants to depict their experiences in artistic and creative ways. So as mentioned, it's an arts-based project. Through virtual arts-based research, I wanted to create an environment where participants could employ creative autonomy and create visuals that really capture their unique experiences as sex workers. The participants were recruited virtually with the help of NZPC, and they were all adult sex workers, 18 years or older, who began in the industry as minors. So I utilized arts-informed inquiry, which is using art to represent a response to a situation studied. And I used this method to investigate how underage sex worker experiences change with adulthood in New Zealand's decriminalized sex industry. So the participants, they had 2 prompts, and from these 2 prompts, they created an art piece for each prompt. So the first prompt is, number one, create an art piece to represent the memories of your experiences as an underage sex worker. And number two, construct an art piece to represent your current experiences as a sex worker. So my participants each created 2 visuals responding to the arts-based prompt, and then afterwards engaged in a semi-structured interview on WhatsApp to kind of discuss their experiences in the sex industry, and then also they discussed the process of creating the art pieces, and that was used to analyze the art pieces, and then with the CGS funding, I was able to compensate participants for their time and effort. Okay, so after for each visual, I employed a visual analysis, which was informed by various interpretations of social semiotics theory, which is concerned with understanding symbols, signs, and meanings. So for each visual, I employed denotation by identifying what is being depicted literally, and then connotation, which is what these depictions mean or represent. And then, like I said, I used the participants' interviews to guide my visual analysis. All right, so the next couple slides are the visuals that were created by the participants. In parentheses, you'll see minor or adult. And so this one is Danny's depiction of his experiences as a minor in the sex industry. So Danny's interpretation of the prompt was unique. So they depicted the differences between expectation and reality when first working as an underage sex worker. So the primary objective of this visual was to juxtapose young and old, and depict the age gap between Danny and their clients using I don't know if you can see it, but the glamorous fingers with the fingernail juxtaposed with the old wrinkled face in the background. The murky colors were intended to depict a body in decay, but however, the decomposing flesh is representative of more than just old age. While the visual depicts a hyperbolic representation of Danny's clients, it also works to represent Danny's perceptions of sex work and how they didn't live up to the glamorous lifestyle it was expected to be. Okay, so this is Danny's adult visual. This abstract visual depicts Danny surrounded by colors while sitting in the bed of a hotel room. There's a gap protruding from Danny's legs. Their legs are spread, and there are insects coming from into the gap in the legs. The hotel room symbolizes the sex industry. The colors are dark, the application is messy, and the lines are blurry. However, in the visual, Danny is clean and clear and distinctly removed from the disarray of the background. The visual framing, it not only works to dissociate Danny from the background, but it also works to encompass his newfound confidence as they aged. Danny says, sex work is something I do more mechanically, and I try to separate myself from it. I feel comfortable with myself now, and the colors are meant to represent like myself being separate from the environment that I'm in. The insects that are depicted in the visual represent Danny's clients. Danny explains that they decided to portray their clients as ants coming and taking what they need, picking up their little morsels and leaving. Danny expands on this metaphor, stating that it's almost like I'm a resource to be mined or used up. So overall, this visual demonstrates Danny's contentment with himself, their dissociation with sex work, and their comfort with the relationship between the two. All right. So this is Kurt's minor art piece, and the car in the visual represents Kurt's involvement with the sex industry as a minor, unfixed, inconsistent, and wavering. Kurt highlights this inconsistency. He says, when I was underage, it was always, wherever I was squatting, staying, doing exchanges, come and pick me up. While the car represents the type of sexual transaction common for minors, which is Carjobs, the object is also a physical barrier distorting the view of the observer. So from Kurt's perspective, the car, as a symbol of underage sex work, is preventing him from witnessing the expansive views of the landscape in the background, which is kind of hard to see. And the advertised words on the top, it says tomboy teen, car job or alcohol only. This represents the nature of Kurt's advertisements as a minor, identifying broadly as a teen or barely legal. Kurt explains that the top represents how it was to advertise because obviously when you're a teenager, especially when you're a teenager without a house to live in, everything is car jobs and out calls. And then the text communication signifies the power that the clients may have over underage workers who are less likely to negotiate the terms of the services. So Kurt's adult visual. In this visual, the observer is positioned on a high-rise balcony of an apartment complex, symbolizing a life of luxury and extravagance. While there is a blockade that offers protection around the balcony, it's a transparent glass, allowing the observer to see the scenery undistorted, which represents that as an adult, Kurt is able to move around the sex industry freely without obstacles and hindrances, but he's also able to experience it fully. The advertisement and text bubbles are representative of Kurt's dynamic working as an adult. The newfound power Kurt is able to exert over his body and his occupation is clearly established in this communication. He explains, I feel like I'm living the luxury high life, especially the physical elevation depicted in the adult visual. Old school sex work is like a car in the bay right near sea level. Now it's like I'm up on an apartment building with a view of the harbor. All right, so Pandora explains that the two visuals were meant to be one art piece together. So I analyzed it as one art piece before I analyzed each piece separately. Pandora states that the two visuals represent my own sort of feelings and betrayal and how that translates into these images. They're both self-portraits based on photos and both based on sort of how I was living and feeling about the work at the time, and I think they kind of speak for themselves in that respect. Pandora also describes that the artwork, both pieces are meant to look unfinished as her journey as a sex worker is not complete. So Pandora as a minor, this visual depicts her as a minor wearing a black top, a masquerade mask, and a wig. And it's representative of her performative acts as an underage sex worker. The body language is indicative of discomfort and insecurity, specifically pertaining to her sexuality. And the dark shadows and the hidden nature of the subject, they represent how it was working as an underage sex worker. She explains, the visual represents working on the outskirts of society and having to work in the shadows and not really being able to sort of take pride in what I do. Pandora as an adult, this visual depicts her as an adult. Her face is clear, the body is nude, and the art piece, like I mentioned, is unfinished. She explains that the body language was intentional. I'm making eye contact, visible face, nude as well. I feel like that represents more of how things are for me now. I'm able to be honest about what I do and take pride in my work. I'm proud of what I do, I enjoy my job, and I see no reason why I shouldn't be. I'm not doing anything illegal. So the nudity represents the honesty and openness Pandora experiences as a sex worker, while also demonstrating her confidence and pride in her sexuality through her body language. So with those findings and then with the interviews, I developed 4 main categories to organize the main changes experienced by underage sex workers when reaching adulthood. These categories are advertisement and client recruitment, setting and type of work, social services, and safety. So advertisement and client recruitment. Participants did not have an issue securing clients as a minor or as an adult. However, as minors, participants relied on free generalized sites such as Craigslist or a website called Cracker, or personal social applications like Grindr. The platforms are not necessarily designed for sex workers, and therefore they do not enforce a rigorous age verification process. So it makes it easy to fabricate birthdays so that minors seem to adhere to the website's guidelines. So Danny explains, you could just make an ad. They didn't have any age restrictions. Well, it did. I mean, you weren't meant to advertise if you weren't under 18, but like they didn't have any way of checking that. Additionally, the participants used vague or misleading advertisements, such as barely legal, as depicted in Kurt's visual, and along with symbols or codes to signify a sexual transaction, making it challenging to identify them as minors or even as sex workers in general. In contrast, adult participants were able to use more public sex work focused platforms, which most sites and agencies that specifically promote sex workers typically have rigorous verification processes. So as adults, they were able to promote on there. All right, setting and type of work. There are some stark differences in the type of sex work available for minors and adults, but all participants were able to engage in the sex industry in some capacity as an underage sex worker. The primary distinction between minor and adult engagement in sex work is the difference in setting, public setting versus private setting. So as adults, each participant could work independently in private settings, but also had the option to work in public settings like in agencies, brothels, or strip clubs. Kurt describes his experience working with an agency. He says, for the past couple years, I've mostly relied on having an agency. I met a good agency manager in 2017 or 2018, and I've been with him at 2 different agencies. He's pretty good at selling me and has regulars and connections and all that stuff, because I really do not like having to do the hustle myself. Conversely, minors are forced to work privately, taking the jobs they're offered in secluded locations that they have access to. The exclusion of minors from public sex work places does not prevent underage sex work. It actually ensures that the minors are confined to unmonitored work, and it ensures that they engage in riskier behavior. While access to social services didn't necessarily change with adulthood, comfort with accessing these services did impact participants' utilization of the services. Kurt recognizes NCPC as a viable resource for minors, but he did not utilize this resource until he was 18. He says, the reason why I didn't utilize NCPC when I was underage was that I just didn't want it to reflect badly on NCPC. I think it would have been more inclined to go straight to the cops than to go to NCPC, because then I could still, get everything taken care of, utilize the safety net that the law gives me without having it look like NCPC is encouraging underage hookers or anything like that. He further explains that once he turned 18, he did feel comfortable accessing NCPC as a resource. He says the main thing that changed when I turned 18 was what I had access to. Like, I had access to NCPC as I needed it. Now I'm of age and I don't feel shitty when I go to NCPC. Though participants did not explicitly state that their safety increased when transitioning from a minor to adult, the factors that did change with adulthood all influenced the degree of safety experienced by these sex workers. One example is with greater flexibility and agency as adults, participants have the power to demand safe sex practices, whereas minors may feel that a condom will impede their income. Kurt explains, he says, yeah, things like my relationship to using protection and hooking has changed a lot. I changed a lot as I've got older. When I was younger, I didn't think that it was important. I just assumed it would lose me bookings and that no one would want to use it. I didn't feel like I had the agency to say, no, we have to use protection. Whereas now I'm like, no, we have to use protection every time. So my primary motivation for the study was to create a research environment where sex workers could artistically depict and represent their experiences as a minor and as an adult. I wanted to amplify the voices and narrative of a population that is typically silenced or spoken for by people in positions of social and political power. Through this research, I wanted to illuminate some of the misleading perceptions present in current sex work research. The inclusion of underage sex worker experiences from academic literature further perpetuates the silencing of minors. As indicated in my research, underage sex worker experiences are impacted by the Prostitution Reform Act and should be included in relevant literature. So I want to encourage policymakers to implement proactive policies aimed at reducing youth poverty and homelessness, rather than policies that prohibit underage sex work. I hope that this research encourages other researchers to include underage sex workers in further studies pertaining to the PRA and sex work decriminalization as a whole, to amplify and validate the experiences of minors. Thank you.
And we'll take the Q&A after all three have had the chance to present. So we will come back and circle around to Q&A, but first we'll invite Natalie Gordon to talk about her work researching in Bolivia.
All right, thanks everybody. Yeah, as Sean said, my research was in Bolivia. Well, not in Bolivia because I was here in Wyoming, but all of my participants were in Bolivia. And I entitled my study Social Reproduction in Coca, Identity, Politics, and the Economy of Coca Growers in the Chapare, Bolivia. So just a little agenda for this presentation. I'm going to start with a brief background so you guys kind of know what I'm talking about and the context in which I did my research. I'll then discuss my research questions, and then I'll really talk about my methods and what changed with COVID. And then finally, I'll discuss my outcomes. So to start, Coca, it's kind of hard to see, is this small green leaf that is an indigenous and native plant to Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia. It's also grown in Colombia. These two regions on the map are the main regions in Bolivia that grow coca. The Yungas is a historical place where coca has always been grown. The Chapare region also has coca, but it wasn't traditionally grown there, and started to have coca grown there in the 50s. So coca is an Andean indigenous heritage, and its indigenous uses continue today. These include drinking coca as a tea, chewing it to get energy, or as medicinal uses. Lots of people use it as medicine or paste, pain reliever, as well as in religious rites. And these continue today, and a majority of the Bolivian population actually uses coca day to day. But the problem with coca is that it is the main ingredient in cocaine. Coca has many alkaloids, one of them being cocaine. And so you take the leaf and you put a bunch of chemicals on it and it turns into cocaine. But in its natural state, it has very limited effects as to what cocaine has. And you actually need a 50-pound bag of coca to make 1 kilo of cocaine. So that's a lot. And so this involvement of the coca leaf in the cocaine trade has created some strife between drug war efforts and eradication campaigns to control cocaine production, and then the farmers who grow it for traditional purposes. These conflicts escalated in the 80s and 90s, culminating in the election of President Evo Morales, who was a coca grower, is a coca grower himself. And this is kind of the context in which I wanted to look at how coca growers changed their articulations or reinvigorated their articulations about their identity and coca. Because in fall of 2019, there was a coup, and Evo Morales was taken out of office, and a right-winged government was put in its place for about a year. And this right-wing government was not pro-coca and started to implement many laws that would prohibit coca farmers from their income and continuing to grow coca. But in November of last year, there were re-elections, and a new president who does support coca was put into place. So these 11 months is kind of what I was looking at to see how people were impacted by the political changes. So I asked, how do coca growers articulate the role coca plays in their social reproduction and group identification? And then how do the recent political vulnerabilities inform coca growers' articulations? So a couple big words in there, so I'm going to define those. First, social reproduction is how daily aspects of life are created and recreated over time through one's livelihood. So in this case, Coca production. Identity for my project I defined as how one expresses themselves based on similarities and differences to people around them. And finally, I thought I would note that I used a political ecology lens, which basically looks at how the human environment power dynamic impacts other things such as politics that we see in our everyday lives. So I'll discuss a little bit about my methods and COVID changes. One thing that didn't really change from COVID from my original plan to my virtual plan was semi-structured interviews. Of course, I wasn't able to do them in person, but this is actually a photo of me completing an interview with one of my participants on the phone. And I actually realized earlier today that you can kind of see my face on the phone, which is funny. So this was, the woman was my participant, and the man in the photo was my research assistant, Jose Luis. And he is a native Bolivian. He knows coca growers, and so what I had him do was go to the Chapare and find friends and people on the streets who were willing to interview with me over the phone, which I knew was probably really strange for them. Not only was I an American, but I was also on a screen. And because of the history of eradication efforts, often headed by U.S. Forces, a lot of my participants were wary at first. So I really had to explain to them I was not a DEA agent. I really wanted to know about their lives and livelihoods. And so we did these interviews through WhatsApp chat and WhatsApp video chat and text. And the interviews lasted between 10 and 45 minutes. I had one participant who was carrying groceries home and stopped on the side of the road for 45 minutes and talked to me, and it was 90 degrees outside. He was very kind. I told him he could go, and he didn't want to. And I had 29 participants, which I was amazed at. I thought I was going to get 5, but Jose Luis really helped me out there. I also made... there we go. I also made some changes to my questions after my first couple of interviews because I realized over the phone some things were lost in translation that you get when you're sitting in person. Because although I do speak Spanish, it is European Spanish, and all of my participants could tell. And so there were a few words that I didn't know, or I would say something that they misinterpreted. So I had to change some questions, and Jose Luis also helped me a lot with that, as he has more experience with other researchers in this same field. But one thing that I did really change was, was my photo voice method. So I had originally intended to do a photo voice method, which is where participants take photos in response to questions, add a caption, and then you can ask them further questions about it, kind of like how Matt did with his arts-based research. But over the phone and with time and translation issues, I only had 3 participants who did the photo voice method, but it wasn't complete. So I had to think about how I could use their photos in a viable method that would add to my research. And I realized that I was getting a lot more photos that weren't in direct relation to my photo voice questions, but added a lot to my interviews. These photos were sent to me by participants, as well as Jose Luis throughout my research. Jose Luis also would call me in the middle of the day when he was driving to show me really cool things. That just made me really jealous that I wasn't in Bolivia, but that was okay. I got to experience it through the phone. And so I combined all of these things along with my field notes, which I took every day, to create a new method which I call ad hoc photo diary. And I think people could start to use this method as a way to do participant observation, which is really hard to do virtually, because you do participant observation just by sitting on the street and watching people go by, and virtually you can't really do that. So that's how I adapted with CGS's help and confidence my research. So from these changes, I was able to completely answer both of my questions. So to start out, one of the participants who responded to the photo voice questions actually answered this question quite well. I asked him what his relationship was to Coca, and he said, it's intimate, very intimate. Coca is life itself. Yes, life itself. Coca is our Cocalero family. Coca is how we articulate ourselves. Coca is a part of the life of a Cocalero. It is our money. It gives to us. Thanks to Coca, we have risen and our children can study. So a couple other points that I gathered from this first question was the importance of the traditional uses and overcoming poverty through coca cultivation. So when I asked people, well, what does it mean to be a coca grower? They said, well, it's everything. It gives us money, it gives us our health, it gives us our life. Lots of people discussed how their children were now able to go to school, go to university because they were able to make more money in a legitimate way. And they also stressed the importance of the political party and the unions, which helped the political party that is in power get into power, which changed the coca policies, allowing coca growers to grow coca legally without the fear of eradication efforts. So Carlos, one of my participants, also answered this question very well. He said, for us to be a Cocalero is a prideful thing because Coca taught us to realize the political structure of the MAS, that's their political party. We Cocaleros as a social organization through our Coca Leaf have formed a political government, the MAS. Our previous governments have always been on the right, the governments of imperialism. They were always demonizing our Coca Leaf. They have always said that Coca is cocaine, but for us, Coca is a culture, more so it is a medicine. Our Coca Leaf is also our economic livelihood of all the families in El Trópico de Cochabamba. In response to my second question of how things changed, I kind of had to get at this in a less direct way. I had to ask people how they felt before and how they felt after the political transition from the MAS to the right-wing government back to the MAS. And the trends I found were that the current political situation was very similar to past experiences in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s with the drug war eradication effort campaigns, where people experienced extreme violence and discrimination. Another main point that I learned was that the younger generation kind of realized the unknown reality of what a right-leaning government meant for Bolivia. Not only coca growers, but also indigenous people, which make up over 60% of Bolivia's population. But as of last November, with the election of Luis Arce, who's the new president, there was a promise of the future and making coca policy even better and including them more in the economy. So not only having coca for Bolivians, but traditional coca products for the world. So the importance of my research kind of revolves around this last point. My participant Carlos said, I understand that your research will be a part of the promotion of coca, that you will raise awareness in the US that the coca leaf is in its natural state a medicine. It is food, it is our culture, it is our livelihood, and it is not a drug. And I really hope that I've done that here today with you guys, and hopefully you'll go research a little bit more about coca because it's a very special plant. And with that, I'll say thank you to CGS and my other funding sources, as well as my participants like this one here. So thank you.
Okay, and our final speaker is Kyle Sabourin. I know you're intending to talk about political factors in the right of return for Syrians, or the facts of returns of Syrians, but since we've had now sex and drugs, I think you're up for rock and roll. So.
Unfortunately, there is no rock and roll. I'm sorry. So, I'm just going to talk about the basis of my research for a little bit. I have not done my research yet because of COVID. Access to the camps by both myself and my partners in Jordan has not been allowed. So, my project is Syrian refugees and political engagement as a factor of repatriation. Repatriation is just a fancy word for return after conflict. And so I'm going to, for this presentation, I'll look at the overview of the Syrian conflict. I'll look at the UNHCR position of refugees and the solutions that they're working towards. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about my research and how those lead into my research. So the Syrian conflict is part of the Arab Spring. It's been going on for a decade now, and it originally began because of political upheaval over human rights abuses, political engagement, and authoritarian regimes. So I'm afraid I'm gonna knock it out and create the horrible sound. And it was worsened by economic issues, and it went from protests very quickly to conflict and the chaos that we see in Syria today. I will note a lot of Syria now has gotten a lot safer in the last 3 years. There are really only 2 areas where we see a lot of fighting still and where most of the news comes out, and that's Idlib and Raqqa. And most of the southern area right now, there are development projects, pre-COVID even. They've been slowed down a bit by COVID, but there are post-conflict development projects in a lot of Syria now. One thing that a lot of people have talked about and has been in the headlines of a lot of the news because of this conflict are the refugee numbers. So there are currently 6.6 million refugees that have been displaced from Syria to other countries. Most of these are in Jordan, Turkey, and Lebanon, and over 85% of these have stayed in the Middle East and North Africa. And the issue here is only 3% have returned, even to that southern area of Syria that's safe. I'll talk about why that is in a little bit, but this is one of the huge problems with repatriation. And
Just be a little careful.
yes, and overall, only about 4% of refugees in general have returned to their country of origin. This includes in a couple of countries in Africa and Eastern Europe and all over Asia. And so there are around 4% of people have returned, and those numbers have gone down over the last 3 decades. And so that is a huge issue that the refugee agency has been facing. And so when we talk about the refugee agencies, we need to talk about the UNHCR. The UNHCR is the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees. And what this office does is they manage refugee issues all over the world. They manage some refugee camps. They help countries with issues that they may have, and really address a lot of the issues caused to other countries by refugees from conflict. So the UNHCR has produced 3 main solutions to huge refugee flows like the one in Syria, and that's the durable solutions. These are long-term or semi-long-term solutions to huge refugee flows. So that's voluntary repatriation, which is returning home after a conflict. There is resettlement, or there is local integration. So what I wanted to focus on is voluntary repatriation because that is the main focus of the UNHCR. However, again, as I was stating, only 4% of refugees have returned. And so I kind of want to look at why that is. And so I dug deeper into the areas of concern by refugees. And that's security, livelihood acquisition, access to shelter, and access to services. Now, when we look at these on face value, these are the things that refugees have identified. These are the things that the UNHCR has identified as issues to repatriation. And security, pretty self-explanatory. Livelihood acquisition includes getting a job, being able to feed your family, access to basic needs such as food, water, and then shelter, availability of shelter, the status of their homes, if they'll be able to rebuild their homes in a timely manner, or if they'll be able to acquire some kind of shelter, and access to services, basically legal services, social services, and things like that. So I was looking at these, and there are a ton of development projects on these. Between USAID, UNHCR, all of these non-government organizations, and yet there's still low numbers of repatriation. So I started digging a lot, and this is really where my research began. So I was looking at all these underlying factors and did all this reading, and I kind of found that one of the underlying things to all of those, and a missing piece that really wasn't being talked about, was political engagement. And so I'll define it in a moment, but when I was reading about political engagement, there were a couple of key things I found. It leads to higher levels of security, which is one of the issues that the UNHCR and refugees around the world have noted is a major issue. And it increases the ability to find employment, and it helps reestablish citizen rights and access to resources in the country. So looking at this, it addresses a lot of the needs of refugees that they have concerns about, and may be able to help find solutions to low repatriation. However, there's not a lot of literature on this. There is some literature about refugees in refugee camps. There is some about resettlement, but as for repatriation, there is really lacking data to show that this is an issue. And so the goal of my research is to kind of look at that and maybe help push policy in the right direction. So when I'm talking about political engagement, what am I talking about? The right to self-identify politically. I am conservative, I am liberal, I am progressive, in American terms, right? Being able to say, I support this political party or this political party without discrimination. The ability to get a job despite this identification, this political identification, and the right to not be discriminated because of it, and to not be discriminated based on sex, gender, race, or citizenship status. So this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about political engagement. So that really led me to my research questions that I really want to help flush out a little more. And the first one is how the prospect of political engagement impacts repatriation plans. And essentially what it is if you think, do you think you will be able to engage in political systems, in voting, in talking to leaders, in self-identifying? And if you do or don't, does that impact how you're going to repatriate? Now, my second question is, if you are already engaging from abroad, whether it be over Facebook or you're talking to political leaders in Syria, does that impact whether or not you're going to repatriate? So those are really my driving questions for my research right now. And so let's talk about my research. So unfortunately, I was not able to do my research over last summer. As I was saying earlier, a lot of that was access to the camps. I didn't have access to the camps, neither did any of my partners in Jordan. But my plan for this summer, when I go, is a large-scale survey project. And my goal is to get about 400 people to take these surveys. They will be in the refugee camps in Jordan with the help of my partners and camp management organizations. And they'll include 4 blocks of questions. Number 1, the views on if they believe they will be able to politically engage when they return to Syria. Secondly, I'm going to look at if they're engaging from abroad. This includes elections, which Syria does have parliamentary elections this year, and they had them 3 or 4 years ago. And being able to vote from abroad is supposed to be a protected activity for refugees. And then I'm going to look at their plans to repatriate in the third block. And this includes, do you believe you will be able to repatriate in the next year? And then factors to that. And then I'm going to look at some demographic information. And then I'm going to do a comparative analysis on these blocks. So when you look at their views of whether or not they'll be able to engage in politics or political decision making, whether it be at a community level or higher level, I'm going to compare that to their plans to repatriate to see if there's any correlation between the ability to engage and their desires or plans to repatriate. Same with translocal political engagement, or if they're already engaging. And then I have demographic information in there to see if it differs between different areas, different people, different educational statuses. And so during this, I will not be asking any identifiable information, and there will be all forced choice questions, so they'll have to pick from a list. The reason I do this is for security and safety of both myself and of my participants, because I will be in Jordan, who has somewhat of a definitive stance on what's going on in Syria. I don't want the participants of this survey to identify themselves as supporting a certain militia or a certain group, say the Free Syrian Army or the Assad regime. This could create social issues for them. This could get them killed if they return to Syria, say after the conflict and they identified with the Free Syrian Army. So that is why I'm using a forced choice question survey. It's going to be a very quantitative project compared to my associates. And also, everything I'm going to use in it is all going to be based off the UN definitions of political engagement. I'm going to use their criteria of whether or not people are going to return within 1 year or 5 years. And that's basically what my plan is. So I want to thank CGS, the Decor Bacon House, and the Office of Engagement and Outreach for funding so I can be able to go do this. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, 3 fascinating projects in my opinion, and I'm sure that there are questions. We'll be happy to take those now. So, if you have any, I'm happy to, well, I can't really wander with the microphone, so you'll have to stand and shout it out, unless you'd like to come up and use the microphone. Yeah, I was thinking about that. We might, we've got some folding, okay, I was going to say the folding chairs. And reach the microphone. Yeah, so up here. And while you're formulating some questions, it occurs to me, and I may be off on this, but fortunately we have Dr. Jean Garrison with us, who not only formerly directed CGS, but brought it into being. So I wanted to check with you, but I think, as I was looking back, I've only been with CGS since the spring of 2019, just in time to get to deal with all the fun fallout of COVID. But I'm wondering, as I looked back at some of the files, I think this may be the 10th year of CGS doing presentations. They were first under a different name, under the Centennial Speaker Series. Okay, I was thinking What in the World had done some out here as well, but maybe not. Is this the 10th year? I think when I was looking, yeah, so party after this. We're celebrating a decade of CGS Speaker Series. Yeah, you can have the first question.
I would ask the speakers to be up there.
And
Stand up.
feel free to pull over on the sides if you want to socially distance a bit more, or you can hang out there. But
So I have one question.
sure.
Kyle, I asked this in the paper you've not seen yet. You mentioned it, but I wanted to know, so you have elections in Syria, but you have Assad as the leader. What do elections really mean in Syria, if anything?
Yeah, so the elections in Syria are parliamentary, actually, so they have nothing to do with Assad. He is completely protected from elections.
Yeah, let me rephrase it. They have elections, but who cares? Assad's in power. So what kind of sense of empowerment does it really give you to vote for a parliament? Now you can refute this. For a parliamentary system, it means nothing.
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's definitely something I need to consider for my survey. The parliamentary elections do help bring some regional voices into the government. Whether or not those have much agency, a lot of it depends on the politics at the time. There are some areas that have some more agency than others. A lot of the federal policies are really pushed by Assad. However, more regional policies, ones that have to do with agriculture and local economies, have to do more with the parliament. And so it is important. It's not as important on a federal level, but on a regional level, it's definitely impactful. So. I think we can keep between us.
I have a question.
Yes.
So my question is about when you're doing in-person research, right, and you have to put together an IRB and so on, and it has specific challenges. And you're trying to do virtual research, and I'm wondering how that affected the permissions you had to get. And I'm thinking particularly also, I mean, in all cases, but the one to do with sex workers, then I have questions to you about, what kind of equipment were you allowed to use for the university and so on in order to make your contacts and things like that?
So before you answer, I'm wondering, are the questions carrying back? Okay, good.
Yeah.
All right.
And say what IRB is, please.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I'll start. So IRB, an Institutional Review Board. I actually had to go to a full board IRB because I forgot to say that Coca is not a drug in my IRB, and that I wouldn't be asking about drug-related activities or associating myself with people who are in the drug trade. So that was cleared up within like the first 5 minutes, and they were like, oh, okay, well, you can go now. I was like, great. But basically it was the same thing. I had to fill out all of the paperwork. I waited so my research took place in November and December of last year. And so I waited until the fall to know if I was actually going to go in person or not, to do my IRB. So my IRB fully revolved around doing it virtually. And my advisor was like, I don't know what you should write, just make it up. So I put in everything. I put a link to WhatsApp privacy policy for more information, so they could do that. I spelled it out for them, but also so they could see that. And I actually feel really bad for people doing research this fall because WhatsApp actually changed their privacy policy. So I got in just in the nick of time. But it was basically the same process. As you saw in the presentation, all of my participants' faces were blurred. That was just to help with their identity. Although I got the sense that none of them cared. If people knew their names, they were like, oh, okay, cool, you're not going to tell people who I am, but it doesn't really matter. Which I thought was interesting because I had thought it would be a bigger deal because of the association with cocaine. But yeah, that was my experience.
Okay, so for mine, because sex work is decriminalized in New Zealand, it wasn't a big deal when I did the IRB, especially because I was working directly with NZPC, who they have been around for a while. And so that's kind of how I framed it, is I would be working with this organization who works with they work with sex workers. And then I also utilized, I mean, nothing came of this, but on the IRB application, I said that I would be looking at like escort websites, or like there's an app or website called Locanto, which they have like an escort category which you can search. And so I mentioned that in all of the application for the IRB, and they said as long as the participants were of age, I could kind of recruit how I wanted to. Nothing came of that. I even posted an ad myself, maybe like on the escort tab, and I was like, I'm a researcher, but I wasn't able to show them like this is legitimate. Whereas like the working with NZPC, they were able to like explain like he is a researcher. Whereas like online, no one was like, yeah, let me do the research. I don't know if that answered your question.
Back to this, I'm interested in Kyle as well, in your case.
Yeah, so as far as I know, I don't have IRB approval yet. I got word back that said I should be receiving it in the next 2 weeks. But basically what I had to do was fill out additional forms that showed how I was going to travel safely, what my COVID procedures would be. Since I'm using tablets for all my surveys, I had to talk about, disinfecting them after each use and stuff. That's really the only additional paperwork I had to do for the Institutional Review Board. And yeah, so I hope that answers your question. It wasn't too much more for me, honestly, so.
Thank you for these great presentations. What fun to listen to amazing work being done right here. For the first two speakers who've done your research, my biggest question is, what was the most surprising thing for you as you got in there? Because I think you came to this project with some hypotheses, like you're also doing, Kyle. But what did you find that you didn't expect to find as you were working with these folks?
Well, I think the most surprising thing for me was how open my participants were about talking about the experience in the 80s and 90s. It's very traumatic, and I was told by my thesis advisor, who's done work in Bolivia with Coca growers as well as other researchers, not to directly ask about it. Like, they'll talk about it if they want to, because it's such a traumatic experience. And I didn't even remotely ask, like, was this like in the 80s? I just said, how was it under the interim presidency? And every single one of my participants was like, it was like the 80s and 90s. It was terrible. It was horrific. And with that, the other surprising thing was how adamant they were that the whole reason this political transition happened in the first place was because the younger generation didn't understand what it was like to be not under a left-wing government. One of my participants even said that the youth saw the president, who had been in power for 14 years, as a dictator, and I wouldn't say that he refuted that, but he was like, but it's better than the alternative, because at least the president, who was in there for 14 years, respected indigenous peoples, respected traditional rights, respected human rights just in general, whereas under the interim presidency, a lot of human rights abuses did take place. There were 3 massacres of coca growers. And then one of my participants also was pregnant during this time, and when I interviewed her, she had a cute little baby. It was very nice. And she talked about the health human rights abuses. So she wasn't allowed to get health care because she was considered a terrorist, a narco-terrorist. So that was kind of the most surprising thing for me.
So the first thing that surprised me the most was the quality of the art pieces that I received, because they sent them to me and I was like blown away. They were like, incredible. So that was the first thing that was shocking. But the second thing is the ability of underage sex workers to get work. Like, none of the participants had issues recruiting or getting clients or anything like that. And then two of the participants, despite being underage, were able, one was able to promote their services on a sex work website, which is very heavily monitored. But they're like, are you 18? And he was like, yep. And so that was kind of shocking, just like, they did find out and then they took him off. But it's something similar. Pandora was a stripper when she was underage, and it was the same thing. They were like, are you of age? And she's like, yes. And then she did that for a while, and then word got around that she was underage, and so the strip club got fined, and then she got fired. But it was just amazing to me, like, the ability for underage sex workers to work in the industry despite the clients being criminalized. So the underage sex workers aren't held liable for their actions as a sex worker. The clients are criminalized. So I guess it kind of makes sense, but the clients don't seem to be deterred by their age, or oftentimes they're just unaware. But yeah, that was the most shocking thing.
I'd like to ask Kyle a question. I know you haven't done your research, so maybe you can't answer this, but do you have any sense of how many of the refugees that you're planning to interview have connections back into Syria and therefore might be drawn by those connections?
Yeah, that's part of the survey project is looking to answer that, I think. I have a whole block on the translocal engagement, how they're, connecting with people back in Syria to help make decisions and do things like that. And so I'm really hoping to find that out. I lived in the Middle East for a long time, and family connections there are very important. And I've actually done some surveying and oversight on some refugee projects before, and from my understanding, there's quite a bit. Now, I know Jordan is a very diverse refugee population, very diverse Syrian refugee population even, so I don't know if that'll differ from area to area, but going into this, I'm guessing it's going to be a lot, but I hope the survey will help answer some of those questions.
Can I ask a second question?
Yeah.
Assad is a member of a minority religious party, or religious organization. I don't even remember the name. Alawis? Is that the right name?
Yeah, there's several terms, but the Alawis are. Yeah.
Does religious identity within Islam affect their connections, whether they're would likely consider themselves to be accepted back in Syria?
Based on the literature I've read, if they're returning to the area where they're from, chances are that they've already established some kind of religious identity in that area. And that's the case for a lot of different places, and that was the case for Iraq as well. I'm not asking those kinds of questions specifically for security. I think it's really interesting, but, if something ever happens and, for example, in Jordan, the Secret Service, their secret intelligence agency there, they can get information very easily, and they can get, the equivalent of a warrant to get your information very easily. And so that's why I'm not asking those kind of questions. I don't want to dabble in anything that could get anyone else in trouble. And that's why their sectarian affiliations, religious affiliations, all of that I've kept out of it. But from my understanding, upon return, if you already have established connections there, especially religious connections, chances are you'll return to many of those same establishments.
Kyle, do you ask how many, or versus a parliamentary? Because that seems to me that'd be significant.
Yeah, so I have many questions. Some of them are local based, and some of them are more federal based. I try to stay a lot away from the federal base, just because of, again, as you were saying, agencies not super high at that level. So a lot of my stuff is community based. But yeah. Any other questions for any of us?
I have a question, Natalie, right? So you talk about your information about proactive policies regarding minors. What does that look like?
So for me, that looks like addressing the factors that lead to underage sex work, which is poverty, homelessness, drug addiction. And so my thought is that rather than criminalizing this institution that's helping these minors make a living, pay their bills, rather than like preventing them from having, the basics, I think that policies should be implemented to work to give them a livable wage without having to engage in sex work. And so I'm not exactly sure what that would look like, but yeah, my thought is like address the homelessness, address the poverty, and then the drug use, stuff like that. Give them other viable options, which they don't have at the moment. They get a stipend, and it's just a couple $100 a week, so it's not enough to live off of. So obviously they're having to resort to other things. So my thought is like just provide them with their necessities.
Can minors get jobs at like 12 or 14 besides like sex workers, like legal jobs? Could they get jobs at that age? Because I know it's different from country to country.
There are ways that 15 and 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds can. A lot of it requires parental, consent, and a lot of them are not with their families. But it's tough because a lot of underage sex workers start as early as 11, 12, and there's not a program, other than just providing them or putting them in like an institution, and a lot of the kids there will escape anyway and not be a part of that. So yeah, I think that there should be something to address the minors that kind of like slip through the cracks of the policies that are implemented.
It's a hard task. I'm from Brazil, and I feel the same way about kids that get involved with drug dealing. You have to address the bottom of the structure, which is education in main case, and it's very hard to do that. It's a very rough concept when you're talking about building out into that policy.
Yeah, and in my thesis, I talk about like the age of adulthood being like ambiguous, and it's just like there's not a lot of like concrete evidence to suggest that 18-year-olds or that 18 should be the age of adulthood. But I also don't have an alternative. It's like you can't just get rid of that age, but you can't like contextualize each individual to determine whether or not they can have rights. So it's tough.
So, just to ask the obvious unasked question, would you then make underage sexual involvement in the sex industry legal?
No. So, at the end of my thesis, I like directly state I'm not advocating for underage sex work. I am using this research to illuminate like the shortcomings of the policies that are implemented, so that politicians will address, like I said, the factors that lead to sex work. So I would like that not to be a discussion, minors involved in the sex industry. I would like to address it before that happens. But yeah, I think that there should be an age restriction. I just don't know how to implement that.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Very good answer. I'm sorry to put you on the
That's
spot.
okay.
So, thank you to our speakers, our panelists now at the Q&A. And thank you also to all of you in the Centennial community for continuing to support us for these 10 years and counting, and in enabling us in the Center for Global Studies to enable young researchers like this, as well as their mentors and faculty in engaging in international research.